stop bargaining with life, how to end your inner war. Buddhism begins with a challenge that many people resist because it dismantles the very habits they rely on to feel secure. It says that suffering is not caused by life being inherently hostile, unfair, or broken. Suffering grows because the mind reaches outward, fastening itself to things it has decided are necessary for peace. Approval, certainty, reassurance, success, recognition, comfort, and control all become objects of dependency. Once the mind believes these things are required in order to be okay, it has already surrendered its freedom. This is the quiet origin of bondage. Not chains made of iron, but chains made of expectation. A person may think they are simply pursuing a good life, when in fact they are building a structure of conditionals. If this person stays, then I am safe. If I succeed, then I am worthy. If I am praised, then I matter. If the outcome goes my way, then I can relax. But peace that depends on conditions is not peace. It is postponement. It is a temporary truce negotiated with reality. And reality does not keep contracts written by fear. The mind that lives this way becomes easy to move. It can be pressured through the fear of loss and guided through the promise of gain. It can be made obedient by the possibility of rejection and seduced by the possibility of reward. This is why attachment is such a powerful chain. It does not always look like weakness. Often it looks like commitment, ambition, loyalty, or love. Yet underneath those noble words, there may be a hidden dependency that hands the world authority over the inner life. To need something in the deepest psychological sense is to give it leverage. This is why the Buddhist tradition treats craving with such seriousness. Craving is not merely wanting something in a casual way. It is the internal posture that says, I will not be at ease unless this condition is met. The object of craving may be approval, success, a particular relationship, a specific identity, or the feeling of being safe. The object itself matters less than the mechanism. The mechanism is what matters. Once peace becomes conditional, you are no longer living freely. You are waiting to be permitted to rest. That waiting is exhausting. A person who needs praise can be controlled by silence. A person who needs to be liked can be guided by disapproval. A person who needs certainty can be governed by ambiguity. A person who needs a particular outcome can be destabilized by inconvenience. In each case, the outside world has been granted a power it should never have possessed, the power to decide the shape of your mind. And yet this is how many people live without noticing it. They interpret their dependency as normal human concern. They call it caring. They call it ambition. They call it sensitivity. But if the inner state cannot remain intact without the world behaving in specific ways, then the self has become conditional too. This is what Buddhism exposes. The problem is not that the world is imperfect. The problem is that the mind expects perfection in exchange for peace. But peace purchased in that way is never stable. It is fragile because it depends on external cooperation. The moment the world refuses to cooperate, anxiety appears, then irritation, then resentment, and often finally anger. The chain tightens. The moment of release comes when the mind sees that needing is the original vulnerability. To need less is not to become cold or detached in the empty sense. It is to stop asking life to function as a supplier of inner stability. It is to recognize that when the heart is chained to outcomes, it can never be fully at rest. One is always waiting, always braced, always low-grade anxious about what may be lost. That waiting appears subtle, but it quietly governs a great deal of human behavior. In that state, people become easy to exploit, not always by malicious others, but by circumstance itself. Praise becomes a hook, criticism becomes a wound, success becomes a drug, failure becomes a collapse. The self is moved around by forces it pretends to manage. It calls this being engaged with life, but often it is only being dragged by life. When the chain of need weakens, something remarkable happens. The person does not become passive. They become difficult to manipulate. They can still value relationships, goals, and achievements without binding their peace to them. They can care deeply without becoming dependent. They can participate fully without becoming owned by the result. This is the beginning of what might be called emotional untouchability. Though not in the sense of being numb or isolated, it is untouchable because it is no longer so easily penetrated by fear. The person becomes dangerous only in the sense that manipulation loses its grip. This is not aggression, it is freedom. and freedom begins where dependency ends. Detachment is often misunderstood because many people confuse it with emotional shutdown. They imagine a detached person as distant, cold, withdrawn, or indifferent, as though the goal of spiritual practice were to become less human. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Detachment is not the cancellation of feeling. It is the removal of clinging from feeling. This distinction matters more than almost any other. Escape is a form of avoidance. A person escapes by suppressing, numbing, distracting, or dissociating from experience. They do not want to feel too much, so they shut the door on their own inner life. Detachment, by contrast, leaves the door open. It allows the experience to arrive fully, but without turning it into an identity or a source of security. The difference is the absence of grasping. A detached person can still love, but they do not try to own what they love. They can still act with intensity, but they do not make their emotional survival depend on the outcome. They can still invest effort, but they are not psychologically imprisoned by the success or failure of what they invest in. In this way, detachment does not reduce life. It restores its clarity. When craving is removed from perception, everything becomes sharper. Objects, people, and situations no longer appear through the haze of desperation. The mind can see them more directly because it is not trying to use them as props in the maintenance of the self. This is an enormous relief. Much of what people call confusion is actually the distortion caused by need. They do not see clearly because they are too invested in what they hope to receive. A mind ruled by attachment will always edit reality. It does not look at what is there, it looks at what is useful for its desire. That is why detachment is such a powerful antidote. It restores contact with what is, rather than what the self wants to make it mean. This also explains why detached action can be so strong. A person who is not clinging to an outcome can act with far more precision, because they are no longer driven by panic. They do not have to force life into a shape that calms their fear. They can respond to conditions as they arise. They can adjust, they can choose, they can let go when letting go is wiser than holding on. That kind of flexibility looks effortless from the outside, but it is born from discipline. It is not apathy, it is not laziness. It is not the refusal to care. It is care without bondage. It is involvement without possession. The mind that understands this becomes less vulnerable to exploitation, because it no longer offers every external force the power to define its inner state. Praise may still be pleasant, but it is no longer a lifeline. Criticism may still be unpleasant, but it is no longer a collapse. Success may still be meaningful, but it is no longer the measure of worth. Failure may still hurt, but it is no longer identity destruction. This is what makes detachment so liberating. It removes the false solidity that the mind projects onto temporary things. Most of what people cling to is impermanent by nature. Relationships change. Bodies age. Circumstances shift. Reputations dissolve. Opportunities vanish. If peace depends on any of these staying fixed, then peace is already doomed. Detachment sees this clearly and refuses to build a throne on sand. Instead, it allows things to be present without becoming prisons. This is not a small shift. It changes the whole relationship to living. The person no longer says, "I must hold this tightly or I will lose myself." They begin to see that their self was never meant to be held together by grasping. Their life becomes less brittle. There is room to breathe. There is space for reality to move without being met instantly by resistance. And because resistance weakens, presence strengthens. A detached mind is more present because it is less busy defending its preferences. It can hear more clearly, see more clearly, and respond more intelligently. It appreciates without gripping. It cares without obsessing. It engages without enslaving itself to the outcome. That is why detachment is not emptiness. It is a cleaner form of contact. In that contact, one begins to discover that the heart does not need to be chained in order to remain open. It only needs to stop confusing attachment with love. The mind's most common method of giving away its freedom is reactivity. Reactivity is the habit of being moved immediately by praise, criticism, fear, desire, offense, or uncertainty. It is the condition in which the stimulus does not merely affect you, it commands you. Many people live almost entirely in this state without recognizing it. They are praised and they brighten. They are criticized and they collapse or defend themselves. They are included and they relax. They are ignored and they become uneasy. Their inner life is constantly being steered from the outside. This is one of the clearest signs of dependence. If approval can lift you and disapproval can wound you, then your center of gravity is not inside you. It has been exported into the reactions of others. At that point, you are no longer fully participating in your own life. You are responding to signals from the environment as though they were final authorities. This is why reactive people are so easy to move, and why they often feel exhausted even when nothing dramatic has happened. They are living in a continual state of being touched, pushed, and redirected. Buddhism offers a different path, response rather than reaction. The difference is the presence of awareness. Reaction is automatic. Response is chosen. Reaction happens before understanding. Response comes after seeing. Reaction is the mind being dragged by its conditioning. Response is the mind noticing its conditioning and refusing to be fully governed by it. This pause between trigger and response is not a luxury. It is the gateway to freedom. In that small space, influence begins to dissolve. The praise that once controlled you becomes only sound. The criticism that once wounded you becomes only information. The emotional wave still rises, but it no longer automatically determines your behavior. You are no longer being handled by every passing event. You are watching the event move through awareness without immediately turning it into a command. That pause is not passive. It is one of the most active forms of inner strength. The person who can pause does not lose life, they recover it. They recover the ability to choose what truly deserves attention. They recover the ability to distinguish between an actual problem and an ego disturbance. They recover the ability to think before obeying the first surge of feeling. This makes them steadier, harder to manipulate, and less easy to provoke. Steadiness is a boundary. A person who is steady in this sense is not easily hooked by praise and not easily broken by criticism. This does not mean they become emotionally dead. It means they are no longer governed by the reflex to chase or flee every emotional signal. The outer world can still send messages, but it no longer writes the script. This is one reason mindfulness matters so much. It does not merely calm the mind. It exposes the automatic quality of reaction. Once you see how fast the mind reaches for agreement, defense, validation, or retaliation, you begin to see how much of your life has been happening without deliberate participation. The observation itself weakens the pattern. What is seen clearly begins to lose some of its power to control. With practice, reactivity gives way to stillness, and stillness becomes authority. Silence grows out of this authority. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of repression, but the silence of someone who no longer feels compelled to answer every provocation with movement. That silence is strong because it is not empty. It is full of awareness. It says, without words, that the world may try to pull, but the center is no longer being dragged. And once the mind knows that, it becomes much harder to manipulate. Wanting less is one of the clearest forms of strength because it removes the bait that life can use to hook the mind. The more intensely a person wants something, the more vulnerable they become to fear, frustration, and distortion. When desire becomes excessive, attention narrows, judgment weakens, and the mind begins to treat the desired object as though it were essential for survival. In that state, one is no longer choosing freely, one is chasing. This is why Buddhism does not treat craving as harmless ambition. It sees craving as instability in motion. A mind that wants too much is a mind that can be exploited too easily. It can be moved by scarcity, by comparison, by envy, by the fear of missing out, and by the panic of not getting what it thinks it needs. Wanting becomes a force that bends attention away from clarity and toward urgency. Urgency is one of the least trustworthy conditions for wisdom. When the mind is urgent, it no longer sees the full field. It sees only the object of its hunger. That hunger may take many forms. It may be the hunger for recognition, for status, for certainty, for control, for pleasure, or for reassurance. But in every case, the pattern is similar. The more desperately the mind wants, the more easily it can be distracted, manipulated, and disappointed. It becomes easier to predict because it becomes less free. Reducing craving does not mean abandoning purpose. It means removing the emotional dependency that makes purpose brittle. There's a difference between direction and desperation. Direction moves with intention. Desperation moves with fear. The first is steady. The second is volatile. A person with direction can work hard, remain disciplined, and pursue meaningful goals without collapsing into agitation. A person with desperation may work equally hard, but their effort is contaminated by anxiety. They are not simply moving toward a goal, they are fleeing the discomfort of not having it. This is why wanting less can actually create more strength. It restores room around the mind. It allows discernment to breathe. It prevents the false urgency that leads to poor choices. A person who wants less is less afraid of delay, less afraid of being seen as incomplete, and less afraid of losing a contest that was never worth entering. Their energy is no longer scattered across 100 imagined shortages. They begin to act from alignment rather than panic. That shift changes everything. The person no longer needs to grasp at every opportunity as though lack were an emergency. They can evaluate what truly matters and leave the rest alone. They can say no without panic. They can wait without suffering. They can move decisively without becoming frantic. This is not a smaller life. It is a cleaner one. Modern culture often tells people that desire is the fuel of progress. In a limited sense, that is true. But desire without wisdom is a source of distortion. It turns life into a market of endless insufficiency. Buddhism is more radical. It suggests that freedom grows when the mind is no longer ruled by wanting. That does not make a person inactive. It makes them less governable by fear. Fear is the hidden engine beneath much of wanting. We want because we fear not having enough, not being enough, not becoming enough, not being seen enough. Wanting is often the mask fear wears when it wants to appear constructive. But when desire is loosened, the fear underneath becomes easier to see. And once seen, it loses some of its power. This is why the practice of wanting less is so liberating. It is not deprivation. It is deconditioning. It removes the internal pressure that makes the mind easy to exploit. A person who no longer needs to win every opportunity becomes more discerning about which opportunities matter. A person who no longer needs every approval becomes more honest. A person who no longer needs every comfort becomes more resilient. This resilience is not coldness. It is stability. The person is not being hardened against life. They're being freed from the compulsive need to grab at it. That freedom creates more genuine appreciation because appreciation no longer comes from hunger. It comes from presence. One can enjoy something fully without needing it to become a foundation for identity. That is the strange power of wanting less. It does not shrink life. It expands the mind's capacity to meet life without becoming owned by it. Emotional independence is the point at which a person begins to understand that their inner state is their responsibility. This sounds simple, but it is one of the most difficult truths for the ego to accept because the ego likes to assign responsibility outward. It says, I am upset because you did this. I am insecure because they said that. I am anxious because circumstances are unstable. There may be truth in the circumstances, but if the mind never assumes responsibility for its own state, then it will always remain vulnerable to being ruled from outside. Emotional independence does not mean becoming detached from others. In the shallow sense, it does not mean refusing connection, warmth, or care. It means ceasing to outsource the maintenance of your peace. You stop expecting other people to manage your feelings for you. You stop requiring them to behave correctly so that you can stay regulated. You begin to recognize that while others may influence your experience, they do not own your inner life. This is a profound shift because it ends a hidden form of dependency that many people never fully see. People-pleasing often comes from the belief that if I keep everyone happy, I will be safe. But this is a bargain with no stable end. It traps the person in constant monitoring, adjustment, and self-erasure. The inner world becomes organized around anticipating everyone else's needs, moods, and reactions. That may look generous from the outside, but inside it is often fear disguised as kindness. Emotional independence breaks that pattern. It allows a person to care without collapsing into servitude. It allows them to be considerate without becoming a hostage to approval. It allows them to remain open without sacrificing themselves at every turn. This is not selfishness. It is the restoration of a boundary between self and expectation. Buddhism's insight here is especially important because it separates feeling from identity. Emotions arise, they move, they change. They are real, but they are not permanent truths. A person who learns to observe their emotions without immediately claiming them as essence becomes less reactive and more stable. They can say, "This feeling is here," without saying, "This feeling defines me." That distinction prevents emotional weather from becoming existential weather. In this way, emotional independence is not emotional suppression. It is emotional literacy. The person becomes able to witness sadness, irritation, anxiety, longing, and disappointment without making these states into rulers. They become less likely to be pushed around by their own inner climate. They can feel deeply and still remain responsible for what they do with the feeling. This has a direct effect on relationships. A person who is emotionally independent does not enter relationships to be completed, rescued, or constantly reassured. They enter relationships voluntarily. They can love without begging. They can speak without performing. They can disagree without fear of abandonment. This creates a healthier form of connection because it is not built on desperation. Desperate relationships are unstable because they are structured around fear of loss. Voluntary relationships are steadier because they are structured around freedom. In the first case, the bond is often hidden dependency. In the second, it is mutual choice. One weakens the self, the other strengthens it. This is why emotional independence is not a rejection of intimacy. It is the condition that makes real intimacy possible. When people are no longer trying to use each other as emotional life support, they can meet more honestly. They can offer love without demanding that love function as a shield against uncertainty. They can stay because they want to, not because they cannot bear to be alone. That is a much more spacious way to live. And from that spaciousness, the mind becomes less easy to manipulate. It no longer needs flattery to feel alive, nor does it collapse under disapproval. It becomes harder to bribe with validation and harder to control through withholding. It stands more firmly on its own ground, not because it has become proud, but because it has become internally accountable. That accountability is the beginning of freedom. The ability to walk away is one of the clearest signs that a person no longer confuses attachment with obligation. Many people remain in harmful situations, not because they truly believe those situations are good, but because they have become psychologically dependent on the idea that they are necessary. They fear the unknown more than they fear the damage. They fear separation more than they fear self-betrayal. As a result, they stay. Staying can sometimes be wise, but staying because you are afraid to let go is not wisdom. It is captivity. Buddhism emphasizes that clinging to what harms you is a form of misunderstanding. It means the mind has assigned too much value to comfort, familiarity, or fear avoidance, and too little value to inner integrity. A person may remain in a relationship, workplace, identity, or environment long after it has become corrosive, simply because they cannot bear the sense of loss that walking away seems to threaten. But often what is being preserved is not something alive. It is only a pattern that has learned to feel necessary. The power to walk away emerges when the mind no longer sees loss as the worst possible outcome. This is not recklessness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that some forms of staying are a subtler form of self-destruction. If an environment repeatedly drains, manipulates, humiliates, or destabilizes you, then staying may actually be a betrayal of your own life. Walking away becomes not an emotional outburst, but an act of lucid refusal. This is why the ability to leave matters so much. It marks the point where fear no longer owns your decisions. You are no longer trapped by the illusion that endurance is always noble. Sometimes endurance is just fear of change. Sometimes loyalty is just fear of solitude. Sometimes patience is just fear of losing the familiar. The wise person learns to distinguish these things. Walking away when it is necessary does not require hatred. It does not require revenge. It does not require a dramatic final speech or the need to punish anyone. It requires only the recognition that your peace is not negotiable. If a situation demands the repeated sacrifice of your clarity, your dignity, or your well-being, then the freedom to leave becomes essential. That freedom is powerful because it removes leverage. As long as someone knows you cannot leave, they have power over you. As long as a situation feels necessary, it can control your behavior. But once your peace is no longer conditional, the fear that binds you loosens. You can step back without panic. You can depart without bitterness. You can end a pattern without turning it into a war. This makes you difficult to manipulate because the threat of loss no longer has the same authority. It is important to see that walking away is not always physical. Sometimes it is emotional. Sometimes it is the decision to stop arguing. Sometimes it is the refusal to keep feeding a dynamic that thrives on your participation. Sometimes it is the inner act of no longer investing in a story that keeps you small. In each case, the essence is the same. You are choosing integrity over dependence. This choice can feel frightening at first because the ego equates leaving with danger. But often the danger was already inside the situation you refused to leave. The fear was preserving a wound. The attachment was maintaining the very thing that was hurting you. Once this becomes visible, walking away begins to look less like abandonment and more like honesty. And honesty is a form of liberation. A person who can walk away when necessary no longer needs to cling out of terror. They can remain where life is nourishing and depart where life has become a trap. That flexibility is not instability, it is strength. It signals that the self has learned to value peace more than captivity. That is one of the deepest forms of inner freedom. Detachment does not make life emptier. It makes life more present. This is one of the most difficult ideas for people to accept because they assume that holding tightly makes experience more meaningful. They believe that the more emotionally entangled they are, the more deeply they care. But attachment often produces the opposite of presence. It creates a haze of anxiety, expectation, and grasping that prevents direct contact with what is actually there. Detachment removes that haze. When the mind stops clinging, temporary things become visible in their true shape. A conversation is just a conversation. A success is just a success. A disappointment is just a disappointment. A person is not turned into an object of possession. A moment is not turned into a guarantee. This stripping away of false solidity allows reality to appear with more accuracy. You appreciate without gripping. You care without obsessing. You notice without needing to own. That is presence. Presence is not passive observation from a distance. It is intimate contact without dependence. The detached person is not absent from life. They are more fully there because they are no longer using every experience to prop up the self. They are seeing the experience itself rather than the identity it might serve. This makes them more responsive, not less. Their attention is cleaner, their love less possessive, and their action less contaminated by fear. This kind of presence makes a person difficult to destabilize because it is not built on temporary conditions. External events may still impact them, but those events do not penetrate to the core in the same way. The challenge is felt, registered, and understood, but it does not automatically become a threat to being. A person can grieve, adapt, or struggle without losing the center from which they witness. That center is what the path protects. Buddhism is not teaching people to live as though nothing matters. It is teaching them to stop projecting false finality onto things that are always changing. Most suffering comes from treating the temporary as permanent and then panicking when it changes. Detachment corrects that error. It reminds the mind that all forms are in motion, and that to cling to motion as if it were stillness is to invite pain. When this is understood, the person becomes less likely to be owned by disappointment. They can feel the impact of loss without losing themselves inside it. They can appreciate beauty without demanding that it remain fixed. They can love deeply without converting love into bondage. They can participate in life with warmth because they are no longer gripping it in fear. This is what makes detachment such a profound form of strength. It does not reduce the richness of life. It removes the false demand that richness be made permanent before it can be enjoyed. It allows things to be temporary without making temporary things worthless. And because the mind is no longer clinging so tightly, it becomes more alive to the present moment. It notices details that desperation would have overlooked. It hears more accurately. It sees more clearly. It responds more wisely. The quality of awareness improves because the mind is no longer spending so much of its energy trying to freeze the world in place. The untouchable quality that emerges from this is not indifference. It is the ability to remain intact while being affected. That is a far deeper stability than mere insulation. The person feels life, but life no longer dictates their worth. They are present, but not possessed. That is the gift of detachment. I can continue with the next sections. if you want me to keep going. Silence is often misunderstood because people judge it from the outside. They think silence means weakness, uncertainty, passivity, or the absence of conviction. But silence that comes from inner authority is none of those things. It is not the silence of fear. It is the silence of a mind that no longer feels compelled to prove its existence through constant explanation. Most speech is not born from clarity. It is born from insecurity. People speak because they want to justify themselves, protect their image, manage how they are perceived, or force a situation into a shape that comforts them. They talk to gain leverage, to avoid discomfort, to win space, or to defend a position. Much of this speech is reactive. It is not chosen slowly and consciously. It is spilled out of tension. Silence interrupts that pattern. A person who has begun to detach from the need for control does not feel the same urgency to fill every space with words. They no longer treat explanation as a form of survival. They no longer assume that if they are not constantly speaking, they are losing power. In fact, they begin to see that silence can hold more authority than argument ever could. Silence is not emptiness, it is containment. It contains the pause in which awareness can remain intact before reaction takes over. It contains the space in which the mind can ask whether speech is actually necessary. It contains the discipline that prevents emotion from instantly becoming conflict. When silence is grounded in clarity, it becomes a boundary. It says that the inner world is not available for casual invasion. It signals that not everything deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves your energy. This matters because a great deal of manipulation depends on pulling you into reaction. If you can be made to explain, defend, justify, or overreact, then your center has been successfully moved. But when silence deepens, that leverage weakens. You are no longer compelled to answer every pressure immediately. You can allow words to remain outside you until it is clear whether they deserve entrance. That is a form of strength people often overlook. The silent person is not necessarily disconnected. They may be more connected than the person who speaks constantly, because they are not using speech to cover unease. Their words, when they do speak, emerge from a quieter place. They are chosen rather than discharged. They are fewer, but they carry more weight. The person no longer talks to fill the void of insecurity. They speak when clarity requires it, and remain silent when speech would only serve confusion. This is why silence and detachment belong together. Detachment removes the grasping that makes speech defensive. Silence expresses the inner non-dependence that detachment creates. Together they form a kind of authority that cannot be easily manipulated because it is not constantly advertising itself. When someone no longer needs to justify every move, they become difficult to steer. They do not need to announce their strength because they are no longer hiding weakness behind noise. They can observe, wait, and act only when the moment actually calls for action. That is why silence is so closely tied to wisdom. It protects clarity from becoming contaminated by urgency. And once that happens, the person is far less likely to be dragged into unnecessary conflict. They are not silence as avoidance. They are silence as sovereignty. The desire to control life is usually a disguised response to uncertainty. People want to control because uncertainty feels intolerable. If the future could be fixed, if other people could be predictable, if outcomes could be guaranteed, then the mind believes it would be safe. But the wish for control often creates more instability than it removes. The harder the mind tries to force life into obedience, the more it loses contact with what is actually happening. This is where Buddhism cuts deeply. It refuses the fantasy that control can produce peace. In many cases, control is exactly what prevents peace from forming. The mind tightens, the body braces, attention narrows, and life is reduced to a set of variables that must be managed. But no one can manage reality into permanent safety. Reality is not a machine waiting for the right person to operate it. It is movement, impermanence, and complexity. Clarity is a better response than control. Clarity accepts that uncertainty is not a flaw in life. It is one of its defining features. Instead of demanding impossible certainty, the clear mind learns to navigate within limits. It notices what can be influenced and what cannot. It responds to facts instead of fantasies. It acts with precision rather than force. This is far more effective because it works with reality rather than against it. The person who insists on control is often trying to silence fear by dominating the environment. But fear does not disappear when the environment is forced. It simply reappears in another form. One thing may be secured, but another becomes a threat. The mind never truly relaxes because the underlying demand has not changed. It still wants life to be guaranteed before peace can begin. Clarity breaks that bargain. It says that peace does not come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from refusing to be governed by it. That is a very different standard. A clear person can make decisions without pretending to know everything. They can take action without demanding certainty as a prerequisite. They can remain steady even while acknowledging the limits of what can be known. This makes them more effective, not less. Force often creates resistance, whereas clarity reduces waste. A person who sees the shape of a situation clearly can move through it with less emotional friction. They do not need to overpower the moment. They need only understand it. That understanding changes their relationship to action. They become less frantic, more measured, and more capable of doing what actually matters. Control also tends to create the very instability it is meant to prevent because it encourages the mind to overmanage everything. It turns small issues into major threats. It turns uncertainty into a personal emergency. It makes life feel like something that must be conquered before it can be lived. But life cannot be conquered. It can only be met. That is why the commitment to clarity is so liberating. It does not pretend that things are easy. It simply refuses to waste energy trying to force what cannot be forced. Instead, it cultivates an accurate relation to reality. That relation is less exhausting and more honest. The person guided by clarity may still prefer certain outcomes, but they no longer confuse preference with control. They can work diligently and still accept that results are not entirely theirs to command. This frees them from much of the emotional turbulence that comes from trying to dominate the uncontrollable. They stop fighting the fact that life is dynamic and start learning how to move with that dynamism intelligently. That is why clarity is stronger than control. Control is brittle because it depends on compliance. Clarity is resilient because it depends on understanding. One demands that life stop moving. The other learns how to stand in motion without losing balance. And once the mind sees that, much of its old anxiety begins to lose its foundation. At the center of attachment is a bargain that most people make without ever stating it aloud. The bargain sounds something like this. If this condition is met, then I will be okay. If this person stays, if this plan succeeds, if this identity is recognized, if this outcome is secured, then I can relax. The mind builds an invisible contract with life, and then behaves as though the contract were real. But life never signed it. This is the source of so much hidden suffering. People spend their days waiting for reality to honor promises it never made. They wait for guarantees, permanence, and reassurance. They wait for conditions to remain favorable. They wait for the thing they love not to change, the person they depend on not to leave, the situation they fear not to unravel. That waiting creates suspended anxiety. Even when things are going well, the mind remains braced because it knows the bargain is unstable. This is not freedom. It is emotional hostage-taking. The tragedy is that the bargain feels protective. The mind believes it is securing peace by attaching peace to specific conditions. Reality, it is building peace on a cliff edge. The moment the condition shifts, the agreement collapses, and the mind falls back into distress. Because impermanence is unavoidable, any peace dependent on fixed circumstances is already doomed. The way out is not to become cynical or detached from life in a deadened sense. It is to stop demanding guarantees from a world that cannot provide them. When that demand is surrendered, the mind is no longer constantly scanning. For the moment the contract will break, it no longer needs to brace itself before every loss. It stops living in a state of preemptive grief. This change is enormous. The person begins to accept that impermanence is not a punishment. It is the structure of existence. Things arise, stay for a while, and pass. Relationships evolve. Bodies age, roles end, opportunities close, mental states change. None of this is exceptional. It is the nature of the world. The suffering comes not from change itself, but from the refusal to let change be what it is. Once the bargain is broken, life becomes more direct. The person is no longer negotiating with reality. every moment in the hope that it will preserve their comfort. They can stand in the present without secretly trying to freeze it. They can love without making love into a guarantee. They can work without treating success as a certificate of worth. They can lose without concluding that the world has betrayed them. This does not make the person less alive. It makes them more honest. They no longer insist that peace must be temporary and conditional. They begin to discover a different kind of peace, one that does not depend on the world staying arranged in a preferred way. That peace is grounded in seeing clearly that the bargain itself was the source of anxiety. To stop bargaining with life is to stop making your peace dependent on conditions you cannot control. It is to stop saying, "I will be okay only if." It is to release the ultimatum and accept that safety was never in the guarantee. It was in the mind's willingness to meet uncertainty without turning it into a crisis of self. That is the real end of the chain. When the bargain ends, the need to cling begins to weaken. The need to manipulate outcomes fades. The need to make reality obey the self loses its force. In that space, the person no longer waits for life to grant permission to be at ease. They discover that peace was never something the world could give or take away. It was obscured by attachment, and once attachment loosens, peace becomes visible again. That peace is not dramatic. It does not shout. It does not demand special conditions. It simply remains when the bargaining stops. And that is where the deepest freedom begins. The deepest freedom does not arrive as a reward for having controlled enough variables. It arrives when the mind finally sees that control was never the real source of safety. For a long time, people believe they are protecting themselves by arranging life into something predictable, but what they are really protecting is the illusion that predictability can be made permanent. That illusion is comforting until it breaks, and life has a way of breaking it often. At first, this can feel like a loss. The mind that has relied on guarantees does not welcome uncertainty as wisdom. It experiences uncertainty as exposure. Yet that exposure is also the beginning of maturity. The person begins to notice that much of what they have called necessity was actually preference hardened by fear. They thought they needed a certain outcome, but what they really needed was relief from anxiety. They thought they needed a person, but what they really needed was reassurance. They thought they needed recognition, but what they really needed was to feel real. This is where the chain reveals itself. Need is not just desire. Need is desire with fear attached. When the attachment is strong, the mind becomes easy to steer. Offer approval and it leans forward. Offer withdrawal and it shrinks. Offer praise and it brightens. Offer criticism and it twists. A person in this condition may believe they are independent because they are functioning well in the world. But inside, they are being constantly negotiated with by their own cravings. Their peace rises and falls according to the weather of external conditions. Buddhism is severe about this because it sees that dependence of this kind is a disguised form of suffering. The person is not truly living, they are waiting to feel safe. And waiting for safety is one of the most exhausting ways to exist. The mind must eventually ask a harder question. What if the thing I have been calling necessary is not necessary at all? What if my life does not require this particular person, this particular status, this particular outcome, or this particular validation in order for me to remain whole? That question can feel threatening because it destabilizes the old contract, but it also opens the door to freedom. Freedom begins when the mind stops bargaining. No more silent deals with life, no more internal ultimatums, no more promises that peace will be earned only after circumstances improve. This does not mean one stops caring. It means one stops handing the keys of inner stability to what is unstable by nature. The person begins to stand on something less visible but far more trustworthy. Awareness, clarity, and the capacity to remain present without demanding guarantees. At that point, a new kind of strength emerges. It is not the strength of clinging harder. It is the strength of not needing to cling. This strength cannot be manipulated in the usual ways because it no longer treats loss as the ultimate threat. The fear of losing begins to lose its power, and when that happens, many of the old pressures simply collapse. What once controlled the mind through promise and threat can no longer do so as easily. The person becomes less persuadable by fear, less seduced by reward. and less shaken by the possibility that life may not provide the conditions they once believed were indispensable. That is not coldness, it is liberation from dependence. And once dependence fades, peace is no longer conditional. It no longer waits for life to behave. It stands even while life changes. A person who no longer needs the world to remain favorable begins to move through it with a different quality of presence. They are less reactive, less desperate, and less interested in forcing outcomes. This does not mean they disengage from life, quite the opposite. They can finally meet life without the distortion of craving. Their attention becomes cleaner because it is not constantly reaching forward to seize what might ease their fear. Presence grows where grasping falls away. Many people assume that caring deeply requires clinging tightly, but this is one of the most damaging myths of the emotional life. Clinging does not deepen care. It contaminates it. It turns love into possession, attention into surveillance, and concern into anxiety. When the mind is holding too tightly, it is not fully present to what it says it values. It is too busy trying to secure it. Detachment, by contrast, allows the object of care to remain itself. It frees the mind from the false solidity it projects onto temporary things. This is why detachment makes a person more present rather than less. Without the urge to possess, one can appreciate. Without the urge to control, one can observe. Without the urge to freeze time, one can actually enter it. The untouchable quality that appears here is not emotional deadness. It is the ability to feel impact without losing center. Challenges still arrive, loss still hurts, disappointment still stings, but the pain does not automatically become identity. The person is touched but not owned. The event is registered but not worshipped as the definition of self. This is what makes the detached mind so formidable. It cannot be easily exploited because it is no longer projecting permanence onto temporary arrangements. A criticism may land, but it does not decide who the person is. A promise may break, but it does not destroy their center. A relationship may change, but it does not invalidate their being. The outer movement of life is no longer allowed to penetrate all the way down into the roots of the self. Instead, the person remains present to what is real. That presence is a form of freedom because it removes the false solidity that craving creates. The mind no longer says, "This must stay as it is or I will fall apart." It learns a more truthful sentence, "This is here now, and I can meet it without pretending it will remain forever." This simple shift transforms the quality of living. Appreciation becomes cleaner, grief becomes less tangled, and action becomes less burdened. A present person can love without gripping. They can work without panicking. They can respond without overreacting. They can remain open without becoming soft in the sense of unprotected. In fact, their openness is stronger than the closedness of the fearful mind, because it is not based on denial. It is based on seeing clearly that nothing temporary can serve as the final ground of peace. This is why detachment and presence belong together. Detachment removes the false promise that life must be controlled. Presence restores the ability to meet life as it is. Together they produce a kind of inward steadiness that makes manipulation increasingly ineffective. The person is not less alive, they are more awake. And that wakefulness is what allows them to enjoy life without turning enjoyment into dependency. Silence grows naturally from this inner stability. When a person no longer needs the world to confirm them, explain itself to them, or cooperate with every preference, they stop feeling compelled to fill the air with defense. Much ordinary speech is driven by insecurity. People talk to justify themselves, to protect their image, to secure agreement, or to keep others from seeing uncertainty. They speak because silence feels vulnerable. But silence, when rooted in clarity, is not vulnerability, it is authority. The person who has stopped bargaining with life does not need to speak just to prove that they are present. They can remain silent without feeling erased. They can listen without preparing a counterattack. They can observe a situation without immediately translating it into a personal threat. This kind of silence is rare because it comes from a mind that trusts its own awareness more than it trusts performance. That trust matters. Without it, speech easily becomes performance. The person says too much, explains too much, defends too much, and reveals too little of real substance. They are trying to maintain control through language. But language cannot create real inner safety if the mind beneath it remains attached and afraid. Silence, by contrast, can create the space where clarity survives long enough to guide the next move. This is why silence is not passivity. It is a container for precision. It keeps the mind from spilling itself into unnecessary conflict. It allows the person to choose words instead of discharging them. It helps prevent the emotional machinery from recruiting speech as a weapon. In that way, silence becomes a boundary not against life, but against confusion. A silent person is not necessarily withdrawn. They may simply understand that not every feeling needs an audience and not every impulse deserves expression. Their silence signals that they are not desperate to be understood on demand. They trust that clarity will speak when needed. Until then, they remain in the pause where wisdom has room to appear. That pause changes everything. It makes the person difficult to provoke because provocation depends on quick reaction. If a remark does not immediately force a response, its power weakens. If an insult meets silence instead of escalation, the dynamic shifts. If a challenge is observed rather than obeyed, the old leverage disappears. Silence breaks the chain that turns sensation into conflict. It also protects dignity. The person no longer has to lower themselves into every exchange just because another person has invited them there. They can remain grounded. They can let a moment pass without filling it with noise. They can choose whether any response is needed at all. That is a profound form of sovereignty. The world often rewards loudness, but it respects those who are not owned by the need to be loud. Silence communicates something that volume cannot. I am not being pulled around by the moment. I am not frantic. I am not begging for space. I am already here, and I do not need to prove it. That is why silence is one of the clearest signs that detachment has taken root. The less the person needs, the less they must announce, the less they cling, the less they explain, the less they fear, the more naturally quiet strength appears. And from that quiet strength, action becomes cleaner than before. The attempt to control life is often born from a fear of uncertainty so deep that it disguises itself as responsibility. People tell themselves they are simply being careful, strategic, prepared, or realistic. But beneath that language there is frequently a more primitive impulse, the desire to remove all risk before daring to relax. The problem is that life cannot be made risk-free. The more aggressively the mind tries to eliminate uncertainty, the more tense and brittle it becomes. Control creates strain because it demands what reality cannot offer. Buddhism does not recommend surrender in the sense of giving up agency. It recommends clarity over control. Clarity is willing to see the limits of what can be managed. It does not pretend to know the full shape of the future. It does not insist that reality must be compressed into the mind's preferred plan before action can begin. It accepts that uncertainty is part of existence and then moves intelligently within that truth. This is a much stronger position than control because it does not collapse when life becomes unpredictable. The person who needs control is constantly threatened by the possibility of surprise. The person who values clarity can adapt. They do not require the world to become simple before they act. They only require enough understanding to proceed wisely. That difference is crucial. Control tries to dominate uncertainty. Clarity learns from it. The controlling mind is often deeply reactive because it mistakes uncertainty for danger. It sees a gap in knowledge and fills it with anxiety. It sees a lack of certainty and interprets it as a threat to survival. As a result, the person begins to force outcomes, push people, micromanage details, and resist change with increasing intensity. Yet this very effort often produces the instability they were hoping to avoid. The tighter the grip, the more friction appears. Clarity behaves differently. It respects limits. It recognizes that not everything can be known in advance, not everything can be fixed, and not every outcome belongs to the self. This recognition does not weaken action, it sharpens it. The person can focus on what is actually available, rather than on what fear wishes were guaranteed. They can plan without becoming enslaved to the plan. They can prepare without pretending preparation can eliminate all uncertainty. This is why clarity is so liberating. It frees the mind from fighting reality while still allowing it to engage reality fully. The person no longer wastes energy trying to bully existence into obedience. They become more effective because they are less emotionally taxed. Their attention is not consumed by resistance. Their action emerges from understanding. This has a direct effect on inner peace. The need to control life keeps the nervous system in a state of low-grade alarm. Clarity, by contrast, allows the body to soften around what cannot be fixed. It teaches the mind that uncertainty is not a defect in the universe. It is part of the terrain. Once that is accepted, a great deal of fear falls away. The person is then free to do what matters without requiring that the outcome be guaranteed. That is the mark of a mature mind. It can move, choose, and care deeply without needing certainty as a precondition for peace. And that is where the path begins to feel grounded rather than strained. The struggle to control ends, and in its place appears a steadier intelligence that can work with reality instead of against it. At the heart of attachment lies a bargain that is never spoken, but often deeply felt. If this happens, then I will be okay. If that person remains, then I can relax. If I succeed, then I will be worth something. If I am recognized, then I can rest. If the future behaves properly, then my peace will be safe. This bargain is the hidden architecture of much human anxiety. The problem is that the bargain is not stable, because the conditions it depends on are not stable. People spend an enormous amount of energy waiting for life to honor agreements it never made. They wait for permanence in things that change. They wait for security in things that move. They wait for the world to become what it cannot be, fully dependable. This waiting creates a suspended kind of suffering. Even when nothing appears wrong on the surface, the mind remains braced, because the inner contract could be broken at any moment. That is not peace. It is a truce with uncertainty. Buddhism refuses this bargain because it sees that the bargain itself is the source of much distress. If peace is conditional, then it is already fragile. If self-worth depends on outcomes, then every outcome becomes loaded with existential weight. If the heart requires guarantees before it can be still, then it will never truly rest, because guarantees are precisely what life cannot provide. The way out is not to become numb to impermanence. It is to accept that impermanence is the basic structure of reality. Everything changes, everything passes, every condition eventually shifts. This is not pessimism, it is honesty. Once the mind stops resisting that honesty, it no longer needs to hold life in a chokehold to feel safe. At that point, the person begins to live differently. They no longer wait for complete certainty before moving. They no longer treat every possible loss as a catastrophe. They no longer negotiate with life as though peace must be earned through control. They start to realize that the bargain was always a trap because it promised safety in exchange for surrendering freedom. Once the bargain is seen clearly, it weakens. The person can still care, they can still love, they can still commit, but they do so without making inner stability dependent on the world preserving their preferred arrangement. That is a profound release. It means that when change comes, it does not necessarily take the center with it. The person may feel pain, but they do not collapse into helplessness. They are not no longer human, they are simply less bound. This is the beginning of unconditional peace. Not the fantasy that nothing will hurt, but the recognition that hurt does not need to be turned into a lifelong contract with fear. The mind can stop saying, "I will be okay," only if it can let go of the ultimatum. When that happens, the need to cling begins to dissolve. The fear of loss loses some of its authority. The old pressure to make reality safe by force relaxes, and in that relaxation, something unexpectedly solid appears, a peace that does not depend on conditions. That peace is not temporary relief. It is the quiet that remains when the bargaining stops. That quiet is not the absence of life. It is life no longer filtered through the fear of losing its conditions. A person who has stopped bargaining with reality does not become detached in the dead sense. They become less divided. Their attention is no longer split between what is happening and what must happen for them to feel okay. This creates a kind of inner simplicity that is rare because it does not depend on the world behaving in a particular way. The shift is subtle at first. The mind may still habitually reach for old contracts. It may still look for reassurance, still want an outcome to confirm its worth, still expect someone to say the right thing at the right time. But now these urges can be seen. Once seen, they lose some of their command. The person begins to recognize the difference between a need that is real and a craving that is merely familiar. That distinction changes the emotional climate of a life. Need says, without this I cannot remain whole. Craving says, I will keep insisting until the feeling of lacking goes away. Neither is freedom. Both are forms of binding. When they weaken, a different mode of being becomes possible. The person can value what is present without turning it into a hostage situation. They can care deeply without collapsing into dependency. They can enjoy without clinging and grieve, without turning grief into a prison. This is one reason the path feels like a return rather than an acquisition. It is not that the person is manufacturing a new self. It is that they are becoming less entangled in the false agreements that once obscured what was already there. The peace they seek is not created from scratch. It emerges when the mind stops insisting that external conditions must remain fixed for inner stability to exist. That is why the end of the bargain is so important. As long as life is being treated like a negotiation, every moment contains an implicit threat. If this condition changes, the self must be protected. If that result fails, the self must be defended. If this person leaves, the self must brace itself for collapse. Such a mind can never be fully present because it is always guarding against possible future damage. It lives ahead of itself. When the bargaining ends, the mind returns to the present. Presence is not passive acceptance of everything. It is the ability to meet what is here without projecting a catastrophe onto it before it has even unfolded. The person becomes less interested in forcing guarantees and more interested in understanding the actual situation. That understanding creates room to respond wisely. It also removes much of the emotional static that comes from trying to control what was never truly controllable. This does not mean pain disappears. It means pain no longer has to be doubled by the demand that reality should have promised more. One can be disappointed without becoming bitter. One can lose without falling into self-erasure. One can face uncertainty without making uncertainty into an enemy. In each case, the mind remains more grounded because it is no longer building its peace on a promise life cannot keep. The deepest transformation here is that the person no longer sees peace as a reward that must be earned through favorable circumstances. Peace becomes the natural result of not clinging. This is a very different orientation. It means the mind is no longer always negotiating a settlement with the future. It can stand where it is, aware of impermanence, and still be at ease. That ease is not brittle. It does not depend on the world staying still. It remains open to change because it no longer mistakes change for threat. When this happens, the person becomes less easy to manipulate through fear and less vulnerable to the promises that once held them captive. They are not chasing a guarantee. They are learning how to live without one. And in that learning, the heart becomes less guarded, not more. It becomes capable of loving without ownership, working without desperation, and existing without continually asking the world to certify its safety. That is the quiet end of the chain. A life no longer based on conditional peace begins to feel different in everyday situations that once would have triggered immediate tension. Small delays become less catastrophic. Disagreement becomes less personal. Silence from another person is less likely to be interpreted as rejection. The mind is still capable of noticing these things, but it does not rush to convert them into proof of danger. That shift may sound minor, but in practice it transforms the emotional weather of an entire life. This is the point at which detachment reveals its practical power. Detachment is not the abandonment of feeling, it is the end of false solidity. The person no longer projects permanence onto temporary events. They no longer treat every interaction as a defining judgment. They begin to see that much of what felt urgent was only emotionally charged because it had been given too much importance. The event itself was often smaller than the story built around it. Once that story weakens, presence becomes easier. A present person is not distracted by the need to constantly secure themselves. They can listen more closely because their mind is not busy defending a position. They can appreciate what is before them because they are not trying to grip it long enough to prevent change. They can engage with life directly, without the haze of hidden ultimata. This kind of presence is subtle, but it is one of the clearest signs that the mind is becoming less dependent. The untouchable quality associated with this state is often misunderstood. It does not mean invulnerability in the childish sense of never being affected. It means that influence no longer reaches the center so easily. Life can still touch you, but it cannot always commandeer you. Events can still matter, but they do not automatically define your worth or your direction. That difference creates stability without rigidity. The body may still feel impact. The heart may still feel disappointment. The mind may still register fear or sadness. But because these states are no longer fused to identity, they can move through awareness without becoming a full-scale collapse. The person learns to allow emotional weather without mistaking it for the climate of the soul. This is why detachment makes someone more present rather than less. A clinging mind is always somewhere else. It is in the future, trying to secure outcomes, or in the past, trying to preserve what has already changed. A detached mind is where its feet are. It sees what is actually here. It does not need to distort the moment to make it obey a hidden demand. That groundedness is a kind of freedom because it loosens the grip of fear. Fear often thrives on projection. It imagines loss before loss has arrived, rejection before rejection has happened, failure before failure is real. Presence interrupts that imagination. It returns attention to actual conditions, where response can be chosen more wisely. The person becomes less reactive not because the world has become easy, but because they are no longer feeding anxiety with endless anticipation. This is the heart of the practice. To be present is to refuse the false solidity of what is impermanent. It is to let events be what they are without forcing them to become proof of a personal catastrophe. It is to remain available to life while no longer asking life to guarantee safety before it can be lived. That availability is powerful. It cannot be bribed with praise or destabilized as easily by criticism. It moves through the world with less friction because it is not dragging around the weight of constant expectation. It sees, it feels, it acts, and then it lets go. That is enough. When silence arises from inner authority, it becomes a form of protection for clarity itself. Much ordinary speech is an attempt to manage insecurity. People explain, justify, repeat, argue, defend, and embellish because they feel that silence might expose something weak or unfinished inside them. They think that if they do not keep speaking, they may lose control of the situation or lose their standing within it. But the person who is no longer dependent on external confirmation does not need to perform presence through noise. They already know they are here. That knowledge changes the relationship to speech. Words are no longer used as armor. They become tools chosen with care and deployed only when they serve clarity. In this state, speaking is not a reflexive discharge but a conscious action. Silence is not awkwardness. It is the space in which one can determine whether a response is truly necessary or merely habitual. This is a very different way of moving through the world. Silence protects against unnecessary conflict because it deprives reactivity of one of its easiest pathways. A sudden comment, insult, or provocation cannot so easily take over the system if the person is willing to pause. The pause creates room for awareness to observe rather than instantly react. That alone can change the entire outcome of an encounter. What would have become escalation may simply pass through. What would have become a battle may remain only a moment. The authority of silence also comes from the fact that it is not performative. Loudness often seeks to be witnessed. Silence does not. It stands without announcing itself. In that way, it can be more powerful than speech because it is not trying to persuade anyone. It is not attempting to dominate the room. It is simply refusing to be dragged by impulse. This becomes especially important in situations where others want to provoke, pressure, or manipulate. The reactive person offers easy leverage. They can be made to explain themselves too soon, to defend too quickly, to react in ways that reveal their insecurity. The silent person resists that leverage. They are not automatically available for entanglement. Their lack of immediate response is not weakness. It is self-possession. That self-possession is a form of inner authority because it says that the mind is not ruled by every passing disturbance. It says that not every statement requires a reply, and not every tension requires a performance. It allows the person to choose the timing and shape of their response, rather than surrendering those things to the pressure of the moment. This does not mean becoming closed or emotionally withdrawn. It means trusting one's own awareness enough to let speech arise from clarity rather than fear. When that happens, words carry more integrity, because they are no longer being used to patch over insecurity. They are being used to express what is actually needed. And sometimes what is actually needed is nothing at all. That is the deepest use of silence. It protects the mind from being pulled into a war it does not need to fight. It gives life room to reveal its shape before the self rushes to label it. It prevents the constant leakage of energy into noise, and in that quiet clarity becomes easier to maintain. The more a person learns to rest in that kind of silence, the less they need to control through language. The less they need to control through language, the less life can be manipulated through fear. That is why silence is not absence. It is the form through which inner authority becomes visible. Clarity is stronger than control because it works with reality instead of against it. Control tries to eliminate uncertainty, which means it often creates more strain than freedom. Clarity recognizes limits and still moves forward. It does not pretend to know everything. It does not require life to become predictable before acting. It only asks for enough understanding to proceed responsibly. This distinction matters because the attempt to control usually comes from fear. The mind wants to force outcomes because uncertainty feels unsafe. But trying to dominate life rarely removes instability. More often, it multiplies it. The harder the grip, the more tension is produced. The more tension builds, the more the mind becomes convinced that even tighter control is needed. The cycle feeds itself. Clarity breaks the cycle by refusing to treat uncertainty as an emergency. It understands that not everything can be secured in advance and not everything needs to be. Some things can be met only as they arise. Some situations must be navigated rather than controlled. Some outcomes belong to conditions beyond personal command. This is not defeat, it is an accurate relation to reality. And once the mind stops fighting the fact that it has limits, its energy can be used more effectively. This is why clarity is so practical. It is not an abstract virtue. It improves action because it removes the distortion of panic. The person who is clear can distinguish between what requires action and what only requires acceptance. They can identify what can be influenced and what must be released. They do not waste energy on impossible battles. Instead, they preserve strength for what actually matters. That is a very different way of living from control. Control is often dramatic but inefficient. It turns small uncertainties into large anxieties. It imagines that, if enough pressure is applied, life will eventually conform. But life is not a machine that yields to willpower alone. It is complex, changing, and often indifferent to personal preference. Clarity respects that. It does not fight the structure of existence. It learns to function within it. This makes the person less emotionally taxed because they are no longer trying to force every situation into compliance. They can act without demanding guarantees. They can plan without attaching identity to the result. They can choose without making the outcome a verdict on their worth. Their peace becomes less dependent on external obedience and more rooted in accurate perception. In that sense, clarity is not merely helpful, it is liberating. It frees the person from the exhausting task of trying to maintain a false sense of control over what will always remain partly uncertain. The world stops being an enemy that must be subdued before living can begin. It becomes a field to be understood. That change in orientation is profound because it shifts the intent from resistance to participation. And participation is more sustainable than control. A clear person can adapt without panic, respond without overreaction, and remain steady without needing every variable to be managed. That steadiness makes them harder to manipulate because they are not constantly searching for reassurance. They are not overcommitted to outcomes as if those outcomes were their entire identity. They can move with the flow of events while keeping their center intact. That is what makes clarity stronger. It does not impose order at any cost. It sees order where it can be seen, accepts uncertainty where it cannot, and responds with intelligence rather than fear. The final release comes when the mind's making an unconscious bargain with life. This bargain is usually built around conditional peace. The mind says in effect, if this happens, then I can relax. If that person stays, then I can feel safe. If I succeed, then I will be enough. If I am recognized, then I can be at ease. The bargain sounds reasonable because it seems to protect the self from uncertainty. In practice, it creates a life of suspended anxiety. Suspended anxiety is one of the most exhausting states a person can live in. Nothing may appear wrong on the surface, but the mind is always waiting, waiting for the condition to be fulfilled, waiting for the risk to return, waiting for the assurance to fail, waiting for the peace to be taken back. It is not fully at rest because its rest was never unconditional. It was always alone from circumstances. Buddhism exposes this bargain as a trap. It points out that if peace requires the world to remain arranged in a particular way, then peace is not truly peace. It is merely temporary relief. That relief can vanish at any moment because the world is impermanent. People change, situations shift, bodies age, outcomes fail, reputations fade. When the mind builds its safety on what changes, it is building on unstable ground. Stopping the bargain means accepting that the world will not provide guarantees and does not owe them. This is not bleakness. It is liberation from a false expectation. The person no longer insists that life must first prove itself safe before they can be calm. They no longer demand a contract reality can never honor. They begin to understand that peace is not found in being exempt from change. It is found in no longer resisting change as if it were betrayal. This shift has a practical effect. Once the bargain is dropped, the person is less likely to spend their days bracing against imagined loss. They are less likely to interpret every uncertainty as evidence that the floor is disappearing. They can move through life without demanding reassurance before every step. This makes them more open, more present, and less easy to manipulate through fear. It also changes the relationship to loss itself. Loss is still loss, it still hurts, but it no longer necessarily becomes proof that life has failed, or that the self has been undone. The person can grieve without adding the second wound of believing they should have been spared the pain altogether. They can accept impermanence without turning it into despair. This is the beginning of peace without conditions. That peace is different from comfort. Comfort depends on arrangement. Peace remains even when arrangement changes. It is not a guarantee that nothing will hurt. It is a way of standing, so that hurt does not automatically destroy the center. The person learns that they do not have to wait for perfect circumstances to live without fear. They can begin now, in the middle of change, by refusing the old bargain. When that refusal becomes real, a great deal of inner tension dissolves. The need to cling weakens. The need to control weakens. The need to bargain weakens. What remains is a simpler, steadier relation to existence. The person is no longer asking life to justify their peace. They are learning to let peace arise from understanding. And that is the end of the chain. When the chain ends, life does not become easier in the childish sense of becoming free of pain, loss, or uncertainty. It becomes easier in the deeper sense. The mind no longer insists on turning every change into a personal crisis. That alone changes the texture of living. The same event that once would have produced panic now produces only clear recognition. The same uncertainty that once felt like a threat now feels like part of the natural movement of things. This is what it means to stop needing the world to hold still for you. A person who has stopped making peace conditional can meet what happens without immediately asking what it means for their value. That is a profound release because it breaks one of the most exhausting habits of the self, the habit of converting circumstance into identity. A delayed response becomes they do not care about me. A failed plan becomes I am not enough. A changed relationship becomes I have lost something essential. The mind performs these translations automatically when it is attached, but once attachment loosens, the translations become less convincing. That shift is the beginning of emotional maturity. The mature mind does not treat every fluctuation as evidence of collapse. It understands that life moves. It understands that security based on fixed conditions is fictional. It understands that the deeper work is not to force permanence, but to learn how to remain upright while impermanence does what impermanence always does. In that understanding, fear loses some of its authority because fear feeds on the assumption that change should not happen. But change does happen, and once this is accepted, a kind of steadiness becomes possible that is not fragile, not theatrical, and not dependent on the cooperation of the environment. The person no longer waits for the perfect arrangement before resting internally. They stop asking reality to provide the terms for peace. Instead, they learn to inhabit the present without demanding a guarantee. That kind of presence is powerful, precisely because it is simple. The mind is no longer negotiating in the background. It is no longer bracing for an invisible bill that life will someday present it. It is no longer trying to hold together a self-image through constant management of circumstances. It is just here, seeing clearly, responding as needed, and letting the rest pass. This is also what makes the person difficult to manipulate. A person who is no longer motivated by fear of loss can no longer be controlled in the same way. They can still care, but they do not crumble if care is not returned on demand. They can still work, but they do not need every outcome to validate the work. They can still connect, but they do not need connection to serve as proof that they exist. This is why the end of bargaining is not emptiness. It is a form of liberation from leverage. The world can no longer easily press the same buttons because the buttons have become less important. Approval still feels pleasant, but it is no longer a lifeline. Disapproval still stings, but it is no longer a collapse. Success still matters, but it is no longer a certificate of being. Failure still hurts, but it is no longer a sentence on the self. The emotional system becomes less reactive because the old contracts have dissolved. And in that dissolving, a new kind of peace comes into view. Not peace as reward, not peace as escape, not peace as a brief break between crises. Peace as a natural consequence of no longer demanding that reality obey fear. That is the beginning of a more grounded life. Detachment, once understood correctly, makes presence deeper rather than shallower. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the spiritual path because people often assume that if they stop clinging, they will stop caring. In reality, clinging and caring are not the same thing. Clinging is possession. Caring is attention. Clinging wants to freeze the object of care in a form that protects the self. Caring can simply meet what is there. When the mind drops its grip, it no longer needs to make temporary things carry a false weight. A conversation does not need to become a verdict. A person does not need to become an extension of the self. A success does not need to become an identity. A failure does not need to become a curse. Things can be appreciated as they are without being forced into permanence. This is what creates presence. Presence is a mode of contact in which the mind is not constantly trying to transform the present into a future guarantee. It is not standing outside the moment and negotiating with it. It is actually here. It notices what is happening without immediately converting that noticing into fear or grasping. This allows life to be felt more directly because the interference of dependency has been reduced. The detached person is therefore more available to reality. They see more clearly because they are not looking through the haze of desperation. They listen more carefully because they are not waiting for every interaction to confirm their worth. They respond more wisely because they are not secretly trying to use the moment to secure emotional safety. Detachment does not subtract life. It removes the distortions that make life harder to meet. This also explains why such a person often appears untouchable. Not because they are unreachable, but because external events no longer penetrate to the core as easily. They can still feel the impact of what happens. They can still be moved by joy, sorrow, challenge, and change. But those movements do not automatically destabilize the center. The self is not being rebuilt or destroyed every time the weather shifts. That is a profound difference. A clinging mind lives in a state of false solidity. It projects permanence onto temporary things, and then panics when those things move. A detached mind knows that nothing temporary can be safely made into a foundation for peace. It does not make less of life, it makes less of illusion. And that is why it can remain more fully present to what is actually occurring. Presence becomes especially visible in difficult moments. A person who has no need to own the outcome can meet hardship without becoming absorbed into it. They can feel pain without adding a second layer of resistance. They can encounter loss without making it into a total identity event. This does not mean the pain is small. It means the mind is no longer inflating the pain into a prison. That reduction in inflation is powerful. It allows the person to remain stable while life changes around them. They are not numb. They are not absent. They are simply not clinging. And because they are not clinging, they are not constantly being dragged away from the present by fear of loss or desire for gain. This is one reason detachment and presence are inseparable. Detachment removes the false solidity. Presence restores direct contact. Together, they create a way of living in which experience can arrive fully without turning into bondage. That is the shape of a freer mind. Silence becomes a natural expression of that freer mind because the need to justify oneself weakens as attachment weakens. Most people speak so much not because they have something essential to say, but because they are trying to preserve an image. They explain to be understood, defend to avoid being seen as weak, argue to prevent loss of status, and fill the air because silence feels too exposed. Their speech is often a strategy of self-protection. But when inner authority develops, speech is no longer used to patch over insecurity. This is why silence can feel so powerful. It is not empty passivity. It is a clear boundary around the mind. It says that not every provocation deserves a reply, not every accusation deserves rebuttal, and not every misunderstanding must be immediately corrected. Silence can hold the space in which the next response is chosen rather than reflexively released. That space is where wisdom survives. A person who can remain silent when others expect a reaction is no longer so easy to manipulate. The usual hooks lose force. Praise cannot drag them into dependence as easily. Criticism cannot push them into frantic explanation as quickly. They are not silence because they have nothing inside. They are silence because they no longer need to perform inner value through outer noise. This kind of quiet is deeply connected to freedom from the bargaining mind. If I no longer need the world to confirm me, I do not need to talk endlessly to secure my place in it. If I no longer need every relationship to provide reassurance, I do not need to explain every feeling to keep it alive. If I no longer need every moment to be controlled, I do not need speech as a tool of overmanagement. Silence becomes the natural resting place of a mind that trusts its own seeing. That trust matters because many conflicts are born not from facts, but from the urge to seize control of interpretation. Too early, silence prevents that. It allows time. It allows sensation to settle. It allows insight to appear before the ego takes over the microphone. In this way, silence is not withdrawal from life. It is a way of protecting life from unnecessary distortion. And because it is not built on fear, it communicates authority without aggression. People can feel when silence is empty avoidance and when it is grounded presence. The first is brittle. The second is steady. The second does not need to announce itself because it is not trying to win. It only needs to remain aligned with clarity. That alignment is what gives silence its strength. It is a form of non-cooperation with the inner pressures that would otherwise push the person into reactive speech. By staying quiet where quiet is wise, the person preserves energy, protects clarity, and reduces the chance that a passing disturbance will become a lasting conflict. Silence, then, is not the absence of power. It is the refusal to waste power on what does not deserve it. Clarity is the final alternative to the illusion of control. Control tries to make the world predictable enough to soothe fear. Clarity accepts that the world will remain partly uncertain and still insists on moving intelligently within that uncertainty. This difference may seem subtle, but it changes the whole architecture of the mind. Control says, I must force outcomes. Clarity says, I must see accurately. One is driven by anxiety. The other is guided by understanding. That is why clarity is more effective. A controlling mind is always exhausted because it is trying to manage reality as if reality were obligated to comply. It turns every unknown into a problem to be conquered. It burdens the nervous system with a task that cannot be completed, the elimination of uncertainty. But uncertainty is not a defect to be fixed. It is a condition of life. The wise response is not domination, it is discernment. When clarity replaces control, action becomes cleaner. A person can move without demanding guarantee. They can make choices without needing certainty to become absolute first. They can engage with the future without pretending to own it. This frees enormous amounts of energy that were previously wasted on resistance. Instead of fighting reality, the mind begins to work with it. That is the difference between a brittle life and a resilient one. Resilience comes from meeting what is actually there. Brittle control comes from insisting that life should first become emotionally safe. But life does not promise that it offers conditions, changes, opportunities, losses, and surprises. Clarity is the capacity to remain effective within that movement. It does not mean accepting everything blindly. It means understanding where action helps and where acceptance is wiser. This makes the person less vulnerable to panic because they no longer interpret every uncertainty as evidence that they are losing control of themselves. They remain grounded in what can be known, and they respond to what can be changed. The rest is no longer treated as an insult. It is simply reality. That is a great relief. For much of life, the mind has been making a private war against impermanence. It wants the good to remain, the bad to disappear, the uncertain to resolve, and the self to be insulated from change. But this war cannot be won. Clarity ends the war by recognizing that peace was never waiting on a victorious outcome. It was waiting on the end of the demand for total control. When that demand weakens, the need to bargain with life also weakens. The person no longer says, "I will be okay if everything goes right." They begin to say, "I can meet what is here." That sentence changes everything because it no longer depends on the impossible. It is rooted in actuality, and actuality is always a better foundation than fear. By the time clarity has replaced control, the mind no longer needs the old chain of conditional peace. It no longer needs every outcome to prove its worth. It no longer needs the world to remain fixed in order for it to feel stable. It can simply participate, adjust, and continue without the exhausting burden of trying to hold reality still. That is the end of the bargain, and the beginning of a peace that does not ask life for permission. The end of the bargain is not a dramatic event. It does not arrive with a thunderclap or a sudden announcement that the mind has finally been cured of all its dependencies. More often it comes quietly, as a series of recognitions that slowly become impossible to ignore. The person begins to see how many times they have treated life as if it owed them guarantees. They see how often they have confused comfort with safety, and safety with peace, and peace with the temporary absence of disturbance. Once these distinctions become clear, the old bargain begins to look less like wisdom and more like a subtle form of fear. That fear was never irrational. It was human, but it was also misleading. It told the mind that uncertainty was intolerable, that impermanence was a problem, that a shifting world must be controlled before one could feel at home in it. Yet the more the mind obeyed this fear, the more trapped it became in the very instability it hoped to avoid. By demanding guarantees, it made itself fragile. By clinging to outcomes, it made itself anxious. By insisting on certainty, it made itself dependent on things it could never fully command. This is the final lesson of attachment. What you think protects you often becomes the very thing that binds you. When the mind sees this clearly, it no longer needs to fight the flow of life. It no longer needs to brace against every change as though change were a betrayal. It can remain open in the middle of uncertainty, not because it enjoys uncertainty, but because it no longer imagines that peace requires its elimination. That is a very different posture. It is not resignation. It is maturity. Maturity does not demand that life become manageable in order to be lived. It accepts that life will remain partly unmanageable and still chooses to stand within it. With dignity, the person no longer says, "I must secure every possible outcome before I can rest." They learn instead to rest in the awareness that no outcome can ever be fully secured. That recognition may at first feel uncomfortable, but it is also profoundly liberating. It ends the exhausting labor of trying to pin reality in place. And once that labor ends, the body and mind begin to soften. The nervous system no longer has to remain in constant alert. The shoulders can lower, the breath can lengthen. The mind can stop rehearsing future injuries as though rehearsal were protection. There is room now for direct experience. There is room for the ordinary textures of life to be felt without being immediately converted into threats or ultimatums. This is not a small adjustment. It changes the whole atmosphere of being. People often imagine peace as something added to life when all the right conditions finally arrive. Buddhism reverses that imagination. It suggests that peace appears when the wrong conditions are no longer being fed by the mind. When the need to control weakens, when the need to bargain dissolves, when the need to make life obey fear loses authority, peace is no longer hidden behind the noise of resistance. It becomes visible underneath it. That peace is not a performance. It does not need to be announced. It does not need to convince anyone. It simply remains available when the mind stops demanding that the world guarantee its comfort. This is why the ending of the bargain is the beginning of real freedom. The self no longer waits for life to prove itself safe. It learns to stand without proof, and in that standing, the chain finally falls away. What remains after the chain falls away is not a perfected personality, but a less burdened way of being. The person still feels, they still choose, they still care. They still encounter loss, beauty, conflict, and change. But the relationship to these things has altered. The events no longer have to pass through a fortress of demand before they can be known. They can be met directly, without first being measured against a hidden contract. This directness is the essence of emotional freedom. It means the mind is no longer required to build its identity around what it wants from life. It can receive what is given without turning every outcome into a judgment on its worth. It can be disappointed without becoming bitter. It can enjoy without gripping. It can leave without hatred. It can remain without fear. It can act without desperation. Each of these capacities is a sign that the old dependency is loosening. The world will still move. People will still leave. Circumstances will still shift. Successes will still pass. Failures will still occur. But the person who is no longer chained to conditional peace experiences these changes differently. They register the movement without converting it into a collapse of self. This is a subtle but profound shift in consciousness. It means that life is no longer a test the self must pass in order to remain intact. Instead, life is simply being lived. That simplicity is powerful because it removes the pressure that once made everything feel heavier than it was. A conversation can be only a conversation. A choice can be only a choice. A setback can be only a setback. The mind no longer needs to turn every moment into a referendum on permanence. It can stand with what is here and let it be transient without being devastated by the fact that it changes. This is also what makes the person harder to manipulate through fear or promise. When peace is no longer conditional, leverage weakens. Praise becomes pleasant, but not essential. Criticism becomes informative, but not defining. Opportunity becomes valuable, but not spiritually coercive. The person is no longer eager to trade integrity for reassurance. That is a form of strength that cannot easily be bought. And because they are less governed by the need to possess or defend, they become more capable of real presence. They are not constantly calculating how to preserve the self against loss. They are available to the moment itself. This availability makes them more alive, not less. They can care with less distortion, love with less possessiveness, and respond with more precision, because fear is no longer monopolizing so much of their attention. In this way, the ending of the bargain is not an ending to life's complexity. It is the end of the inner struggle that made complexity unbearable. The person still meets hardship, but hardship no longer has the final word. They still experience longing, but longing no longer dictates their worth. They still encounter impermanence, but impermanence no longer feels like an insult. The self is no longer standing in the middle of existence with clenched fists, trying to force the world to become a guarantee. It has learned at last that peace is not purchased by forcing, but uncovered by releasing. That release is the final freedom. Not because life becomes easy, but because life no longer needs to be easy for peace to be possible. The mind has stopped making its well-being conditional on what it cannot control. The chain is gone. The bargain is broken. What remains is a clearer, steadier presence that can meet reality without demanding that reality first become something else. And that is enough. The final freedom is not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of inner surrender to difficulty. Life may continue to unsettle, disappoint, interrupt, and rearrange itself, but the mind no longer has to become a prisoner of each disturbance. This is the quiet revolution at the center of the whole path. What changes is not the world's willingness to be favorable. What changes is the mind's willingness to remain at war with what it cannot command. That war had consumed enormous energy. It asked the body to stay tense, the emotions to stay alert, the thoughts to stay busy, and the self to stay ready for impact. It turned ordinary life into a series of negotiations with fear. It made peace feel conditional, temporary, and always at risk of being withdrawn. But when the person sees through this pattern, the entire structure begins to weaken. They recognize that the price of maintaining the bargain was far greater than the discomfort of releasing it. Releasing it does not mean becoming careless. It means becoming honest. Honest enough to admit that no amount of attachment could ever make the impermanent permanent. Honest enough to admit that no amount of control could ever guarantee safety. Honest enough to admit that the mind's hunger for certainty was never going to be satisfied by the world. The world is not built to promise. It is built to change. Once that is accepted, the person can finally stop trying to extract permanent security from temporary forms. They can enjoy what is present without demanding that it stay. They can care deeply without turning care into captivity. They can invest effort without converting effort into a demand for cosmic compensation. This is a lighter way to live, not because it removes seriousness, but because it removes the extra weight of impossible expectations. What appears then is a kind of grounded trust, not trust that everything will go according to plan, but trust that whatever arises can be met. This trust is stronger than optimism because it does not depend on favorable circumstances. It comes from seeing clearly that the self is more spacious than the reactions it once believed defined it. The person is no longer reduced to what they lose, what they fear, or what they crave. They are the awareness in which these things come and go. That awareness does not need the world to slow down. It does not need every outcome to be agreeable. It only needs the courage to remain open when the old reflexes ask for armor. And in that openness, the emotional system begins to change. Fear loses some of its urgency. Anger loses some of its heat. Desire loses some of its tyranny. The heart becomes less like a fortress and more like a clear field. This does not make the person weak. It makes them less capturable. They are no longer easy to manipulate through promises of approval or threats of loss. They are not easily pulled off center because the center is no longer built from conditions. It is built from clarity, and clarity does not require life to be static in order to remain steady. It can move with reality without being swallowed by it. That is the end of the chain in its deepest sense. Not merely the reduction of one reaction, but the ending of the inner bargain that kept reactions alive. When the bargain ends, the need to cling ends. When the need to cling ends, fear loses much of its authority. When fear loses its authority, peace is no longer something the world can grant or withdraw. It is simply present, unforced and unearned, waiting beneath the noise that once covered it. The person who reaches this point does not become perfect. They become free enough to stop confusing their temporary states with their deepest truth. And in that freedom, they can finally live without the exhausting need to make life confirm them before they are allowed to rest. There is a final simplicity that appears when a person no longer needs the world to confirm their right to exist in peace. It is not a dramatic revelation, and it does not arrive with the emotional fireworks that the ego prefers. More often it feels almost ordinary. The body is less braced. The mind is less argumentative. The heart is less busy negotiating with the future. For the first time in a long while, the person is not constantly preparing for a loss that may never come, or clinging to a gain that will never stay. This ordinariness is profound. It means that life is no longer being filtered through the fear of being made powerless by circumstances. The person can meet uncertainty without turning it into a personal insult. They can encounter disappointment without collapsing into bitterness. They can witness the leaving, the failing, the changing, and the ending without needing to turn each one into evidence that peace was a lie. Peace was never a lie. It was simply obscured by the habit of bargaining. That habit is what Buddhism calls us to see through. It is the subtle, almost invisible contract that says life must provide guarantees before the mind can soften. Yet the more carefully one examines that contract, the more obviously impossible it becomes. The world does not promise permanence. It does not promise loyalty to our preferences. It does not promise protection from loss. And because it makes no such promise, the attempt to live as though it did becomes a source of constant agitation. When the mind stops insisting on those guarantees, something remarkable happens. It begins to breathe in a different way. It no longer has to convert every event into a threat to identity. It no longer has to ask whether a situation will preserve its sense of self. It can simply notice what is here and allow that noticing to be enough. This is not passivity. It is freedom from inner compulsion. A person in this state is harder to shake because they are no longer standing on the crumbling platform of conditional peace. They are not waiting for approval to stabilize them. They are not waiting for recognition to prove them. They are not waiting for the right outcome to make them whole. They can act, care, and choose without secretly demanding that the universe reimburse them for their effort. This is why the end of the bargain is so important. It ends the emotional blackmail we often place on existence itself. It ends the silent ultimatum that says, if you do not arrange the world correctly, I will not be okay. That ultimatum is what keeps the mind tense, suspicious, and vulnerable to manipulation. When it disappears, the person becomes less capturable because they are no longer trying to buy peace through compliance with conditions that were never stable. Instead, they meet life directly. They see that things arise and pass. They see that relationships are living processes rather than permanent possessions. They see that success does not become a self, and failure does not erase one. They see that the world cannot be made to stop changing, and because of that, they stop asking change to behave like a prison sentence. Change becomes what it always was. Movement, and movement does not have to destroy presence. The person who understands this lives with a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of someone who believes they can control everything, but the confidence of someone who no longer needs to. They know that inner peace is not granted by the stability of forms. It is uncovered when forms are allowed to be temporary. This makes their life less fragile and more open. They can receive what comes without making it into an idol or a wound. That openness is the beginning of wisdom. It is the point at which the self stops demanding that the world become proof of its safety. It is the point at which fear loses its ability to define what matters. It is the point at which life is no longer treated as a series of negotiations for permission to relax. The permission was never outside. It was always hidden beneath the noise of attachment, waiting to be recognized. Now it is recognized, and because it is recognized, the chain no longer needs to hold. When the chain no longer holds, the mind discovers a very different kind of strength from the one it once admired. It is not the strength of hard edges, forceful reactions, or the ability to overpower disturbance through sheer intensity. It is the strength of not being owned by disturbance at all. A person can feel the wave without becoming the wave. They can witness the rise of fear, anger, or longing without rushing to turn it into identity. This is a quiet strength, but it is immense. It makes the person less vulnerable to the old instruments of control, because those instruments usually depend on fear of loss, fear of shame, or fear of exclusion. If someone no longer needs the world to validate them in order to remain steady, then many forms of pressure simply stop working as before. The mind is no longer easy to move by threat or reward. It has become less dependent on the conditions that once ruled it. This does not make the person isolated. It makes them available in a cleaner way. They can love without possessing. They can speak without performing. They can remain silent without feeling erased. They can walk away when necessary without hatred. They can stay when staying is wise without self-betrayal. That flexibility is not a sign of weakness. It is evidence that the self is no longer trapped in the reflex to cling. Because clinging is what made the old life so fragile. The person once believed that if they held tightly enough, the object of attachment might remain stable enough to keep them safe. But that was always a false hope. What is temporary cannot be made permanent by force. What is changing cannot be pinned down without damage. And what is outside the self cannot be used as a reliable foundation for peace. Once this becomes clear, the desire to grip begins to lose its charm. The mind then becomes more economical with its energy. It no longer spends so much of itself managing imagined futures, rehearsing injuries, or seeking constant confirmation. That energy is returned to presence. The person notices more, they feel more accurately, they respond more intelligently. They are less likely to be pulled into unnecessary conflict because they no longer instinctively interpret every shift as a threat. The world does not become simpler, but the person's relation to it does. This simplification is profound because it reduces the hidden burden of constant self-protection. The person is no longer dragging around a fortress of expectations and defensive habits. They are no longer scanning every moment for signs that they might be made small. That vigilance, which once seemed like maturity, is revealed as a constant expenditure of life. Once it begins to soften, life becomes more available, and in that availability, something deeply human appears. The capacity to care without collapse. The capacity to remain tender without being owned by tenderness. The capacity to be strong without becoming hard. The capacity to meet reality without demanding that it first become safe. This is not the fantasy of invincibility. It is the truth of groundedness. A grounded person is not untouched by life. They are simply no longer easy to unseat from their center. That center is not a fixed persona. It is awareness itself, steady because it does not depend on the approval of passing conditions. From there, even loss can be met more cleanly. Even uncertainty can be lived through more honestly. Even endings can be held without turning them into proof that peace was impossible. The old fear that everything meaningful must be protected at all costs begins to fade. What remains is the ability to participate fully, without demanding permanence as the price of love. That is the quiet power Buddhism points toward, a power that needs no display, a power that cannot be easily manipulated, a power that becomes visible only when the mind no longer needs to prove it has won. The final gift of this path is not that life becomes free of pain, but that pain no longer has to be multiplied by resistance. A difficult event still hurts. A loss still hurts. Rejection still hurts. Change still hurts. But the mind no longer adds the second injury of insisting that the pain should not exist. That insistence was often the real source of suffering. It turned an ordinary wound into an identity crisis. It turned a moment into a narrative. It turned temporary disturbance into prolonged bondage. Once that second injury falls away, the person can feel the truth of the moment without making it into a prison. This is the meaning of unconditional peace. Not the fantasy of never being touched by hardship, but the freedom to meet hardship without surrendering the center. The person no longer waits for the world to become favorable before they allow themselves to be at ease. They no longer imagine that peace must be purchased through perfect circumstances. They see that peace was being obstructed by the demand that conditions should not change. That demand can end. When it ends, life is no longer approached as an endless trial of whether the self can survive the next disturbance. It is approached as a field of changing conditions, to be met with intelligence, patience, and clarity. The person can choose without panic. They can care without possession. They can endure without bitterness. They can leave without hatred. They can remain without fear. These are not separate achievements. They are expressions of a mind no longer split by conditional peace. This is the deepest form of emotional independence, the recognition that your inner state is your responsibility and that no one else can hold it for you. Others may influence you, circumstances may challenge you, but none of that has to decide who you are at the center. Once this is understood, the self stops begging the world to keep it safe. It starts learning how to stand in truth, and truth is steadier than comfort. The person who stands in truth no longer needs to be continually reassured that they are enough, because they have stopped outsourcing enoughness to external conditions. They no longer need to chase approval as if approval were oxygen. They no longer need to fear walking away from harm as if departure were failure. They no longer need to control every outcome as if control were the only way to remain whole. The grip loosens, and with it, the suffering that grip created begins to dissolve. What remains is not a perfect life, it is a freer one. A life in which silence has authority. A life in which detachment allows presence. A life in which clarity replaces control. A life in which the mind no longer bargains with reality. A life in which the chain has broken, and the person finally sees that the peace they were chasing was never hidden in the world at all. It was waiting in the end of grasping. The chain has ended when the mind no longer begs reality to certify its safety. That is the final release, and it is much quieter than the ego expected. There is no grand announcement, no triumphant self-congratulation, no perfect state to display as proof. There is only a mind that has stopped making peace dependent on conditions it cannot control. In that stopping, something immense becomes available, a life that is no longer organized around fear. This life is not free from pain, but it is free from the extra burden of fighting what pain means. It no longer turns every change into an accusation. It no longer turns every loss into a collapse of identity. It no longer turns every uncertain moment into a demand for control. The person has seen that control was never the same thing as stability, and that attachment was never the same thing as love. Once those illusions are seen clearly enough, they lose their authority. What remains is a simpler relation to existence. The person can receive without clinging, act without desperation, speak without needing to dominate, and remain silent without needing to disappear. They can encounter the world as it is instead of as their fear insists it should be. This does not make them detached in a cold sense. It makes them available to truth, to experience, to change, and to the quiet intelligence that arises when the mind is no longer at war with itself. That quiet intelligence is stronger than the old compulsions, because it does not require the world to behave in order to remain steady. It does not depend on constant reassurance. It does not live and die by approval. It does not need to be protected by anger, because it has already stopped making the self into a fragile object that must be defended at every turn. The fortress is no longer necessary. Its walls were built from expectation, and expectation has been seen through. This is the end of the bargain, the end of the chain, and the end of the exhausting effort to hold life still long enough for the self to feel safe. Safety was never in the freeze, it was in the release. When the release finally happens, the heart discovers that it was never meant to be a prisoner of conditions. It was meant to move with life, to witness change without panic, and to rest without asking permission from the impermanent. And so the final truth is this: when you stop needing the world to confirm you, you no longer have to defend yourself against it. When you stop bargaining with reality, you stop building suffering on top of what is already difficult. When you stop clinging to what cannot stay, you discover a peace that was never dependent on staying at all. That peace is not owned. It is not achieved in the ordinary sense. It is uncovered when the mind finally stops reaching for chains and recognizes that freedom was always present beneath them.